Mickey, and you're watching a really crappy knockoff version of Crash Course.
Today we're going to be talking about the Berlin Crisis and the Berlin Airlift.
August 2nd, 1945, Germany was split into 4 different zones. The eastern part was controlled by the Soviet Union, which were communist lovers, and the north, south, and the west were controlled by capitalist lovers, the USA, France, and Britain.
Between 1947 and 1948, cooperation between the 4 major powers broke down!
The Allies, minus Russia, wanted to contain communism and help Germany join international community of democracy with its own federal government.
The action of the Westerners agitated the Soviets and eventually led them to try and expel capitalism from Germany.
There were 3 main events that triggered the Berlin Crisis.
1. The institution of the Marshall Plan. The U.S. essentially gave $12 billion, which in today's currency is about $120 billion, to all European countries to help them rebuild their war-torn countries and economies. But all the communist countries under Stalin's orders were not allowed to accept any of this money. This led to an extreme economic difference. The Marshall Plan was one of the greatest actions of the West for containment, which basically meant meeting the communists wherever they went and containing their hopeful spread of communism
by introducing capitalist government to the people that the Soviets were trying to control.
I mean, as you can imagine, America was spending all this money pushing capitalism into Europe. They were boosting up consumerism, and ultimately this is what won the Cold War of capitalism against communism.
See, because once the Germans were introduced to the consumer-driven market, they became entitled to both their individuality and their ability to buy, like us in modern day. And so they were no longer willing to submit to the standards of communism that the Soviet Union was trying to push on them.
2. The Foreign Secretary Conference of 1947 contained the 4 major victors of the war. This meant France, Britain, Russia, and the US. But in this meeting, they made no decisions on what to do with Germany. So after this, France, Britain, and the US had another conference called the London Conferences, where they didn't invite Russia. They're going to team up their 3 sides of Germany, creating a new country, and they were going to create a democracy and a federal government in Germany.
They merged their 3 Western occupied zones in 1947.
They were hoping to create a new country called
Mazonia.
This was high-key behind the Soviets' backs, so they were hella pissed after this point. Not to mention that in the West's attempt to establish a democratic government in Germany, they established a new currency. What this did was it rained total chaos in East Berlin since everyone was trying to frantically exchange for the new currency. And remember, the Soviets wanted complete control over the society so they could have a total communist
government.
With this currency change,
the Soviets lost total power over what was their rightful territory.
3. Because the Soviets were excluded and pissed from the London conferences, they officially left the Allied Control Council. This was the official council of the 4 victors of World War II, in which they were deciding what to do with war-torn Germany.
All 3 of these events led Stalin to the end of his wits, and this triggered his action to create the Berlin blockade.
He cut off all of the roads, so there was no electricity, no water, no food, no transport in general.
The Berlin blockade was Stalin's attempt to intimidate the Allies into leaving West Berlin.
He wanted to spread communism.
So who was sitting idly by and watching this atrocity take place? Which nations avoided the trouble brewing as the USSR stepped into Western Berlin? I'll tell you who wasn't sitting idly by in a lawn chair with a beer resting on their gluttonous gut. The US.
The people of West Berlin were deprived. This blockade was blocking off all of their sources of life. So,
the US played a significant role in leading the relief system that was able to pull Western Berlin out of this hole they were in. A hole without water, a hole without fuel, a hole without food. Who can live without food? I know I can't! So what these Allied forces do? I got one word for you.
airplanes!
The United States and the United Kingdom responded by airlifting food and fuel to Berlin from Allied air bases in Western Germany. From June 24th, 1948 to May 12th, 1949, the Allies flew over West Berlin, dropping needed supplies, water, fuel, anything the citizens needed. Allied planes made trips approximately 500 times a day, and at the very height of the campaign, a plane was landing in Western Berlin every minute. That's a lot of food.
There were many cases where Soviet military would agitate American pilots or possibly intercept the American airlift. Though, overall, Stalin made no actual move to stop the Westerners' project. He was avoiding confrontation and furthermore conflict, since after World War II, Russia was pretty broken up and the economy was trying to recover. Eventually, the Soviets see basically more things are coming into Berlin than they were when the roads were open before we closed them. And so,
May 11th, 1949, the Soviet Union lifted the Western Berlin blockade,
they lifted the blockade. They lifted the blockade!
and the Western Berlin airlift was proven to be successful.
So did America stepping into an uneasy political situation not end in total disaster? You're darn
Right.
Less America, no more.
Important people of this time?
Winston Churchill.
Stalin.
Franklin
Roosevelt.
Harry Truman.
Stalin.
The Cold War. It was an ideological war in the strictest sense of the term, because no one actually wanted a real battle. What it was a battle of ideas against democracy and capitalism and communism. On the smaller scale, the Berlin crisis was all about re-establishing Germany with whose ever sense of government. But on the larger scale, the Cold War as a whole was each side of ideology trying to dominate as much as they could, knowing that the other side wanted to crush them. The Berlin Airlift was the West's way to contain the spread of communism because it enabled them to stop the people from flocking to the communist leaders and to value consumerism and therefore the capitalist market.
So,
What's your question?
I'm just wondering how did this change economics?
So, due to the Marshall Plan, the West Berliners had a much stronger economy than the East. So, people from the East, skilled workers, families, they're all moving over to the
West.
In the middle of 1961, 30,000 Germans were moving to West Berlin every single month. So this made a huge economic divide, not to mention that the Soviets were like,
We have no more workers in East Berlin.
so what did they do? They built a wall. The wall
Closing East Berlin.
Was built August 13th in 1961.
So! After the Berlin blockade, the two major superpowers broke into open confrontation, a race of the arms.
For nuclear weaponry.
And the Soviet Union exploded their first atomic bomb much sooner than anyone thought they would in 1949. Basically, there was a bunch of Americans still over in Europe, and now capitalists and communists were in a full-out war, height of the Cold War. It was spicy.
So did this affect the culture of Berlin?
Well, you can imagine with the economic divide as well as the substantial difference in the political opinions of East and West Berlin, a rivalry quite broke out. Especially in West Berlin, the political peoples were often bullied, mocked. Radio stations were constantly openly mocking West Berliners.
So yes, culture was affected.
So, tell me, what about the politics?
Well, I mean, I guess you could say that after the whole Berlin crisis, the Soviets were expelled from the friendly international community. So directly after the Berlin blockade, what actually happened was the NATO agreement came out, which was protecting the essentially non-communist countries from communist aggression.
Bye.
I'm Mickey.
And you have completed
Dinosaurs!